On December 25th, 1991, the red flag came down from the Kremlin for the last time. No explosions, no gunfire, no columns of soldiers retreating through the snow. Just a piece of cloth sliding down a pole while the world held its breath. To most people watching, it felt clean and symbolic, democracy beating communism. History closing a chapter exactly the way it was supposed to. A perfect ending for speeches, documentaries, and victory laps. But that image hides the real scene, because while cameras focused on ideology, something far more brutal was unfolding behind closed doors. Inside Moscow's accounting offices, there were no slogans left to chant, only empty ledgers and unpaid bills. The Soviet Union didn't collapse under protest or rebellion that night. It collapsed the way companies do when the numbers stop working. Quietly, embarrassingly, irreversibly. This wasn't the death of an idea or the failure of belief. It was the moment a balance sheet finally told the truth. The largest empire on Earth, a state armed with roughly 40,000 nuclear warheads, capable of destroying the planet several times over, no longer had the cash to reliably buy bread for its own people. Power without money turned out to be an illusion. So forget revolutions and grand speeches. What you're about to hear isn't a political fairy tale. It's a forensic investigation into the largest bankruptcy in human history and how a superpower didn't fall. It defaulted. Empires usually fall to enemies. They lose wars. They get invaded. They're dragged down by someone stronger. That's the story we're used to. But the Soviet Union didn't collapse under foreign fire. It collapsed under invoices, payment schedules, and numbers that stopped lining up. There was no final battle where it lost. There was a moment when it simply couldn't pay anymore. And once that happened, everything else began to rot at the same time. It wasn't defeated on the battlefield. It wasn't voted out of existence. It wasn't even toppled by protesters alone. Those came later, after the damage was already done. The real collapse happened quietly, deep inside the system that was supposed to keep the whole machine running. The Soviet state drowned in its own economic design, a structure that looked powerful on the surface but depended on a fragile flow of money underneath. For decades, the myth said communism failed because people stopped believing in it. That sounds clean, almost moral, but belief was never the binding agent. Payment was. The system worked as long as the state could pay for stability, cheap bread, cheap housing, guaranteed jobs, a massive military, and loyalty at home and abroad. The moment the money started disappearing, belief followed it out the door. Loyalty cracked first, then authority, then fear. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, the Soviet Union was already living inside that contradiction. It looked like a superpower, but it functioned like a company surviving on a single client. Oil exports brought in hard currency, and that money quietly held everything together. It paid for food imports, especially grain from the United States. It paid for subsidies that kept prices artificially low. It paid for influence in Eastern Europe, for the war in Afghanistan, and for maintaining military parity with the United States. None of that was optional. Every month, the bills came due. This is the hidden mechanism most people miss. The Soviet system wasn't just inefficient, it was cash dependent. Rubles couldn't buy wheat or machines abroad, only dollars and gold could. So when oil prices later collapsed, the damage wasn't ideological, it was mechanical. Imagine a massive factory where every conveyor belt depends on a single power cable. When that cable snaps, nothing explodes, the lights just go out, one section at a time. To understand how a superpower goes broke, you have to go back to the moment it mistook cash flow for strength, the moment it believed it had finally become rich. In 1965, deep beneath the frozen ground of Western Siberia, Soviet geologists hit something that changed the fate of the entire system. Oil. Not a modest reserve, not a supporting resource, but the Samotlor field, a vast inland sea of crude, one of the largest oil discoveries of the 20th century. To the leadership in Moscow, it felt like salvation. The economy was already slowing. Factories were choking on inefficiency, consumer goods were scarce, and agriculture was failing to feed the population. Fixing all of that would have required painful reforms, political risk, and time. Oil offered a shortcut, a way around the hard work. Once the drilling began, the logic of the system quietly shifted. The Soviet Union no longer needed to make things the world wanted to buy. It didn't need competitive factories or productive farms. It just needed to extract oil and sell it for hard currency. That money could cover the cracks. It could buy grain from abroad, machines from the West, and patience from the population at home. What looked like strength was really relief, the kind that reconvinces you the illness is gone when the painkillers kick in. Then the 1970s arrived. and with them, a global shock. The OPEC oil embargo sent prices soaring. Energy markets panicked, the West scrambled, and suddenly, the Soviet Union found itself on the winning side of history's timing. Oil prices surged, and Moscow became one of the biggest beneficiaries on Earth. Billions of dollars in hard currency poured in year after year. This wasn't rubles trapped inside the system. This was real money dollars that could move across borders, buy food, fund imports, and sustain a global empire. The effect was intoxicating. Oil revenues paid for cheap bread, cheap housing, and subsidies that kept everyday life stable. They financed a massive military, supported satellite states in Eastern Europe, and masked the deep structural failures underneath. The leadership didn't see a warning sign. They saw proof that the system worked, but the mechanism quietly flipped. The Soviet economy stopped being an engine and became a pump. As long as oil kept flowing and prices stayed high, the machine survived. But everything, the budget, the food supply, the military, even political control became tied to one fragile variable, the global price of a barrel of oil. It looked like prosperity. In reality, it was anesthesia, numbing the system while the disease spread underneath. Oil money didn't strengthen the Soviet economy. It quietly took its place. Once the cash started flowing, reform became optional, then inconvenient, then dangerous. Why tear apart broken factories when oil revenue could cover their losses? Why fix agriculture when crude exports could buy grain from abroad? Why risk social unrest by changing the system when raw materials were selling themselves on global markets? The leadership didn't make a dramatic decision to stop trying, they simply drifted there. Year by year, budget by budget, choosing the easier path every time. This is how the Soviet Union slid into a familiar trap. It became a commodity export economy wrapped in the armor of a superpower. Oil, gas, and raw materials went out. Food, machines, and consumer goods came in. The country stopped producing things the world wanted and focused instead on extracting what the world needed. On paper, the numbers worked as long as oil prices stayed high. Underneath, the productive core of the economy slowly hollowed out. Oil money paid for almost everything that kept the system stable. It subsidized bread so prices stayed artificially low. It kept housing cheap. It financed energy discounts to Eastern Europe to buy loyalty and political alignment. It sustained a military that consumed roughly 20% of GDP, an enormous burden masked by export revenue. Oil didn't just fund the state, it silenced problems before they reached the surface. Shortages, inefficiency, stagnation, all of it could be delayed with hard currency. The hidden mechanism was simple and deadly. The Soviet budget became addicted to a single input. Every major obligation: food imports, foreign machinery, military spending, geopolitical influence depended on one variable: the Kremlin did not control the global price of oil. The entire system balanced on that number like a skyscraper built on a single pillar. As long as oil stayed above $30 a barrel, the structure looked solid. From the outside, it even looked invincible. But this kind of stability is an illusion. It doesn't bend under pressure, it snaps. When money replaces productivity, strength becomes conditional. The Soviet Union wasn't building resilience, it was burning through luck. Each year of high oil prices made reform less likely and collapse more severe. The system wasn't preparing for the future, it was renting the present. And the bill, unseen but compounding, was waiting for the moment when the price finally moved the wrong way. By the early 1980s, the illusion was starting to show cracks and markets are very good at spotting weakness. In Washington and Riyadh, the picture was becoming clear. The Soviet economy wasn't diversified, flexible, or resilient. It was dependent. High oil prices weren't just helpful, they were essential. Oil had become the drug keeping the system functional, and everyone watching could see the addiction. At the same time, the world around the Soviets was changing. Western countries began using energy more efficiently. Demand growth slowed. New supplies started coming online from Alaska and the North Sea, adding pressure to an already fragile balance. The global oil market, once tight and explosive, began to loosen. Prices wobbled. Volatility crept in. For an economy balanced on a single number, even small movements mattered. Then came September 1985. Saudi Arabia, tired of sacrificing its own market share to support high prices, made a decisive move. Oil Minister Ahmed Zaki Yamani announced the kingdom would stop holding back production. The restraint was over. The taps opened, crude flooded the market, and prices collapsed with shocking speed. What had sold for around $35 a barrel in 1980 fell to roughly $10 by 1986. For the Soviet Union, this wasn't a normal commodity cycle. It wasn't a temporary dip that could be waited out. It was structural failure. In the span of months, roughly half of the state's hard currency income disappeared. The budget had been built for expensive oil, but the bills didn't shrink with the price. Food still had to be imported. The military still had to be funded. Allies still expected subsidies. This is the hidden mechanism turning lethal. When an economy replaces productivity with a single revenue stream, price becomes fate. The Soviet Union had no shock absorbers left, no alternative exports, no competitive industries ready to step in. The moment the price collapsed, the system didn't bend, it snapped. What looked like power suddenly revealed itself as leverage in someone else's hands. And from that moment on, the countdown began. The collapse of oil prices exposed a weakness that had been there all along, waiting for the worst possible moment to surface. Despite controlling some of the most fertile farmland on Earth, especially in Ukraine, the Soviet Union could not reliably feed its own population. This wasn't a drought problem or a temporary shock. It was structural. Collective farming was so inefficient that as much as a half of the potato harvest rotted before it ever reached a store shelf. Fields produced food, but the system couldn't move it, store it, or distribute it fast enough. So the Soviet Union did something that should have been unthinkable for a self-proclaimed superpower. It bought food, not a little, but millions of tons of grain, year after year, and it bought that grain from its main geopolitical enemy, the United States. By the early 1980s, nearly 50% of all the hard currency the Soviet state earned was being spent just to import grain and keep the population fed. Oil paid for wheat. Wheat kept social order intact. That was the trade. When oil prices collapsed, that arrangement didn't adjust. The food bill stayed exactly where it was. Grain ships still arrived on schedule. Their demands didn't change. They didn't accept rubles because rubles were useless outside the Soviet system. They demanded dollars or gold, real money. And suddenly, the state didn't have enough of either. This is where the borrowing spiral began. Faced with empty shelves and the risk of social unrest, Moscow turned to Western banks. German, French, and British institutions were eager to lend. After all, this was the Soviet Union, a nuclear superpower, a state with vast resources and gold reserves. The idea that it could default felt absurd, so the loans flowed in. But this money wasn't building new industries or fixing agriculture. It wasn't investment capital, it was emergency funding. It was being used to buy food, consumer goods, and time. The Soviet Union wasn't borrowing to grow. It was borrowing to survive. Like a household putting groceries on a credit card after losing half its income. The debt kept the lights on while quietly guaranteeing the collapse later. They weren't financing the future. They were borrowing to eat. When Mikhail Gorbachev took power in 1985, he arrived with urgency and optimism, convinced the system could still be repaired. He wasn't wrong about the diagnosis that something was deeply broken, but he misunderstood the severity. He believed the Soviet economy was sick, stagnant, inefficient, overdue for reform. In reality, it was already dying. What he saw as a cold was terminal cancer, quietly spreading beneath the surface while the body still appeared strong. Perestroika was meant to restart the engine, modernize industry, invest in machine building, make Soviet factories competitive again. But reform at that scale required money, and Gorbachev assumed oil revenues would provide it, just as they had for years. The problem was timing. By the time he took office, the oil money was already disappearing. The budget he inherited was built on prices that no longer existed, and the collapse was moving faster than policy could. Then came a decision that accelerated everything. Gorbachev launched a sweeping anti-alcohol campaign, motivated by real concern over the health of the Soviet workforce. Vodka consumption was devastating productivity and life expectancy. Morally, the move made sense. Economically, it was catastrophic. Taxes on vodka were the second largest source of state revenue after oil. Restricting sales wiped out billions almost overnight. The population didn't stop drinking. They adapted. Moonshine production exploded. Sugar vanished from stores as people bought it in bulk to brew alcohol at home. The state lost the revenue entirely while still dealing with the social damage. By 1988, deficits were no longer manageable. They were spiraling, with oil income gone, vodka taxes collapsing, and debt already mounting. The government reached for the last tool it still controlled. It printed money. Rubles poured into the economy to cover wages and obligations. but nothing new appeared on store shelves. The mechanism turned vicious, cash multiplied, goods did not. The system wasn't being stabilized, it was being hollowed out in real time. And from that point forward, the collapse was no longer just inevitable, it was accelerating. By the late 1980s, the Soviet economy entered a phase that looked abstract on paper but felt brutal in daily life. Rubles flooded the system as the state printed money to cover wages and obligations. But nothing new appeared on store shelves. This imbalance created what economists call a monetary overhang, too much cash chasing almost nothing. For ordinary people, it meant standing in line for hours without knowing what they were waiting for. If there was a line, you joined it. Bread, sausage, toilet paper, it didn't matter. Whatever showed up might be gone tomorrow. This is where the social contract finally snapped. For decades, the Soviet state had traded freedom for stability. You accepted limits, and in return, the system guaranteed basics, cheap food, cheap housing, predictable life. Now, the money in people's pockets meant nothing, and the shelves were empty. Stability vanished, and with it, obedience. The authority of the state didn't collapse in a single moment. It leaked out through empty stores and endless queues. Outside the country, the damage was becoming impossible to hide. Western banks started running the numbers and saw the pattern clearly. The Soviet Union was borrowing to pay interest on earlier loans. Debt, which had been almost non-existent just years earlier, had surged past $50 billion and was heading towards $70 billion. This wasn't expansion, it was a warning flare. In 1989, Eastern Europe broke free. Politically, the images were powerful walls falling, regimes collapsing. Economically, it was catastrophic for Moscow. The old closed trading system disintegrated overnight. Former satellite states demanded payment in dollars, not rubles. Trade that had once been internal now required hard currency the Soviet Union no longer had. By 1990, desperation turned visible. Moscow began secretly selling gold abroad, flying bars to London and Zurich just to pay for the next shipment of grain. The sales were so rushed and so large that they pushed global gold prices down, reducing the value of what little remained. The mechanism was now fully exposed. The state wasn't managing a crisis. It was liquidating itself, asset by asset, month by month, just to stay alive one more week. By 1990, the Soviet state was no longer just weak. It was coming apart at the seams. The republics began withholding tax revenue. And the financial spine of the Union snapped. Boris Yeltsin, leading the Russian Republic, ordered tax collectors to keep money at home instead of sending it to Moscow. Overnight, the central budget evaporated. The Kremlin still issued commands, but it had no income to back them up. Power without cash became theater. That same year, the collapse turned physical. Ships loaded with meat and butter anchored offshore and refused to unload. Payments had bounced. The checks were worthless. Captains waited for confirmation that never came. Inside the country, the unthinkable happened. The Soviet Union asked the West for humanitarian aid. A superpower that had defeated Nazi Germany and raced the United States into space was now begging for food. The humiliation was total. Desperate, the state seized foreign currency accounts from its own enterprises, draining dollars and marks wherever they could be found. Trust died instantly. The ruble stopped functioning as money. Prices became meaningless. Contracts meant nothing. The economy slid into barter. Factories paid workers in whatever they produced: tires, glassware, machine parts. People stood by roads trying to trade goods for potatoes. The black market became the only real market, and the dollar became the only real currency. Taxi drivers, waiters, and anyone with access to foreign cash rose to the top while scientists and engineers sank. In August 1991, hardline communists tried to reverse the collapse by force. Tanks rolled into Red Square. The coup leaders wanted control, order, and obedience. But they had no plan to fix the debt, no way to restock shelves, no money to pay anyone. You can't shoot a balance sheet. The coup failed not just because people resisted, but because there was nothing left to rule. By December, the final numbers came in. Gazbank was insolvent. Gold reserves, once rumored to be vast, had fallen to roughly 240 tons. The vaults were nearly empty. On December 25th, 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev resigned, not because an enemy conquered him, but because he could no longer write checks. The Soviet Union didn't end with a gunshot or a revolution. It ended the way companies do, with an overdraft notice stamped across an empire armed with nuclear weapons. When the Soviet Union vanished, the debt didn't It didn't dissolve with the flag or disappear with the ideology. It stayed behind like a ghost that refused to leave the room. The new Russian Federation inherited the seat at the United Nations, the nuclear arsenal and the full weight of the Soviet Union's foreign obligations. Russia agreed to take on 100% of the debt in exchange for Soviet assets abroad. It was the price of continuity, and it was crushing. The 1990s that followed were not a fresh start. They were the aftermath of a long financial overdose. Prices exploded, rising by roughly 2,000%. Life savings evaporated almost overnight. Ordinary people who had spent decades working inside a closed system woke up to find their money worthless and the safety net gone. This wasn't just economic reform gone wrong, it was a withdrawal. The pain wasn't caused by the collapse itself, it was the delayed cost of years spent living off oil money and borrowed time. The new state had no buffer. There was no cash to soften the transition, no reserves left to protect the population. Subsidies were slashed, not because of ideology, but because there was nothing left to fund them. The chaos of the decade was written directly into the ledger books of the old empire. It wasn't until oil prices began rising again in the 2000s that the story finally started to close. Higher energy revenues allowed Russia to stabilize its finances, rebuild reserves, and service old obligations. In 2017, the last remaining Soviet-era debt was paid a final installment to Bosnia and Herzegovina. The account was finally closed. It took 26 years to finish the bankruptcy of an empire. Not to rebuild it, not to redeem it, just to pay off the bill for pretending it was richer than it ever was. What happened to the Soviet Union fits a pattern that shows up again and again in history: the resource illusion. Natural wealth creates the feeling of strength, but it doesn't automatically create a strong economy. The Soviets mistook what they owned in the ground for what they had actually built. Oil felt like proof of success. In reality, it was a substitute for it. Luck arrived at exactly the wrong moment. Instead of forcing reform, high oil prices delayed it. Easy money removed urgency. Structural problems were ignored because the cash kept flowing. Over time, extraction replaced production, and selling raw materials replaced making things people wanted. The system didn't grow more capable, it just grew more dependent. Power became tied to something the Kremlin didn't control. Survival was pegged to a number scrolling across trading screens in London and New York. As long as that number stayed high, the illusion held. The military looked unstoppable. The ideology sounded permanent, fear still worked, but when the price dropped, the illusion shattered instantly. At that point, nothing else mattered. Not nuclear missiles, not slogans, not secret police. None of those can generate hard currency, move grain across oceans, or pay interest on debt. Resources don't save systems that stop producing. They only delay the moment of reckoning. The Soviet Union didn't fail because it had oil. It failed because oil allowed it to believe it didn't need anything else. The Cold War wasn't decided by a missile launch or a military parade. It ended quietly, when a grain shipment became too expensive to unload. When a superpower armed with nuclear weapons couldn't clear a payment for food, the outcome was already sealed. No ideology can survive an empty pantry, and no amount of firepower can substitute for a functioning economy. The hammer and sickle didn't fall in battle, it didn't get ripped down by an enemy, it simply ran out of balance. What collapsed wasn't belief, it was solvency. The moment the state lost the ability to reliably pay for bread, everything else became theater. Power turned symbolic, authority became conditional, fear stopped working. This is the part history often gets wrong. Empires don't usually collapse in flames. They decay in spreadsheets. They weaken in accounting offices. They fail when obligations outgrow income and the gap can no longer be hidden. By the time flags come down and speeches are made, the real ending has already happened months or years earlier. An empire that cannot pay for bread is not an empire at all. It's a system on borrowed time, ticking down with every unpaid invoice. The countdown clock doesn't announce itself. It just keeps running, quietly, until one day there's nothing left to subtract. History doesn't repeat, but balance sheets rhyme. The names change, the flags change, the slogans change, but the mechanism stays the same. Power looks solid right up until the moment the numbers stop working. That's when strength turns out to be conditional, and authority turns out to be rented, not owned. If you want to understand where today's empires are fragile, don't start with speeches or military hardware. Follow the money. Watch what they export, what they import, and what they quietly borrow to keep the lights on. Look for the moment when income masks weakness instead of fixing it. That's where the real story always is. And if you want more stories like this where power collapses quietly, line by line, without a final battle or a dramatic announcement, stay curious. Because the real endings are never carved in stone or written in blood. They're written in the margins of the ledger, long before anyone notices the flag coming down.